Philip Beesley, and I work as part of a collaboration located in Toronto and part of Waterloo Architecture School. We're a bundle of disciplines. We're architects and scientists, we have some poets, and we have some engineers. And we are working together to try to create a kind of vision for the future of architecture, an architecture that might live, that might breathe, that might in some ways start to work responsibly and craft a kind of relationship with us. The work that I'm sitting in right now is one stage in the Hylozoic series. The Hylozoic series, which is speaking about the possibility of things coming alive, of being built up out of materials. This is something that we started working on quite directly about 4 or 5 years ago. Now, I was trained in architecture and I still practice, but my own training told me that architects make monuments, make static, firm stages for human action, which is durable. A kind of sense of permanence in the world is such an incredibly satisfying thing for a building to offer. Instead, we're trying to think of this kind of architecture as being one which is alive, which lives with us. Instead of it being our servant, a stage for our action, it becomes something to negotiate, a kind of a mutual relationship. And here we can see some of the structures that are organized throughout the work, such as this basic tetrahedron shape, which is very tightly nested, creating a minimum amount of waste. And then this creates the corrugated digrid, the textile core form, which is organized to create the hyperbolic scaffolds, which make them the main textile-like cores of the architecture of this system. Within that flexible core are then the mechanisms which allow the overall systems to flex and move in rippling chains, as I was just explaining. Inside these bladders is salt that pulls material into it, creating a kind of a thick, humid fertility. There are also needles and traps that pull and collect material. So this is an active kind of system, making a kind of an aerial, fertile soil. The systems here are talking to each other. They're organized by small microprocessors that you can see here in packs. And so each of these has a village-like form of a small amount of intelligence. The center of these is a series of flasks which hold protocells. And those are synthetic cells that are just small incubating systems where an individual vesicle of material is putting out a small veil of felt-like skin, starting to grow. It attempts to create a tone, a tangible kind of space for an architecture, not as the expansion of power or the creation of clarity, a kind of proud figure, but rather to touch in a myriad of tiny ways, creating an ambience, a kind of reflection back in which the surroundings might feel us and we might be felt in an entanglement, in an involvement. The idea that I am one thing, that this is one integrated body, very quickly becomes absurd. In fact,
This is a rather approximate bundle of rather loosely grouped together systems. And it's as true for the brain and the emotional centers as it is for my body. So this raises the question of boundaries, of polarization, of a question of how we move through the world. I find the project, and what motivates me most of all in this project, is an attempt to discover a way of relating to the world. I think that this kind of work asks us to work in fiction as well. That is, in painting a picture of the possibility of new relationships, of probing the kind of relationships with the world that might be at the edges of our perception as well.
The delta, theta, alpha, beta frequencies, which are the primary ones, and that runs from 1 to 30 hertz. And sometimes people cast the purple as gamma, which would be 30 hertz and above.
Well, it's a very fragile environment, and it's expanded, and it has many sharp and fragile things in it that can break, and you can get snagged, and it's a little bit like walking in a very, very thick rainforest or woods. In traditional terms, you could say, oh, we must have this as a no-touch environment, we must put boundaries around it, it's impossible, it cannot survive. And yet, having seen how people react to these environments, it's very interesting to see that a rather different set of emotions and values comes forth, because instead of it being destroyed, people come in and they take care of it. There's a sense of touch, of nurturing, of care that's generated, it seems, when a kind of resilient fragility is offered back. And in fact, children, rather than being dangerous, know exactly what to do when they come in here. They touch, they play, they tug a little, they discover the limits, and then they learn how to behave. We don't have to think just about vandalism or making us the hardest subway station with the toughest tiles and steel and stone. Actually, it's possible to think about people caring and generating a sense of an environment.
I think it's a gorgeous piece. The first thing it reminded me of was a garden, sort of a secret garden, and then when you look closely, you see all these different things, and I think that's what keeps it interesting.
The artist just told us that you also feed the plant. So I think that's a very interesting thing about thinking art, connection between nature and humans.
I think it's very pretty. It's very subtle, the movement in it, which makes it very exciting to look at. It's different. It's not that obvious, so you have to focus a little bit on it.
I think it's a wonderful mesh of nature, technology, and I think it's an experience that you really have to give you over. You have to indulge in it. And what I really love about it is the smell.
The next generations of this work will try to touch on a much more robust kind of chemical metabolism, which might start to move outside of the glass flasks that you see here. perhaps making strands of material that can start to clothe the outer structures. We're not sure whether this will work because it makes a sticky mess right now, but we still are very hopeful. It makes a kind of a fertile soil. At the same time as that move, we're going to try to orchestrate much more coherent movement, akin to the kind of emotion that a dancer knows so well, into the system. So the kinetics are going to be more developed. And we're also trying to generate a much more sensitive sensor field. And when I say that, right now we have rather local reactions. If you touch something, or if there's a proximity, or a space, a dimension, you can get local kind of responses. It's a bit akin to poking something and having it move. And we build up many signals that way. But what we're trying to do is generate a sense of fields, almost an expanded physiology around each person that moves through this environment. We're not sure whether we will be able to do that through thermal sensing, through heat sensing. Perhaps we can even get to pheromone sensing, that is a kind of a chemical sensing of the trails that move around each of us. And that might produce a sense, rather than isolated individuals on a stripped stage, perhaps it will produce some sense of the way that we are all deeply entangled and are in fact a great composite being. I guess there's a hope that we can get to that stage anyway.